Mom sided with stepdad and his kids, kicked me out, but they forgot that I own the house. Now it's time to take it back. It never occurred to me, 35M, that my father's meticulous estate planning would ultimately cause our family to fall apart. There's a lot to digest here, and I want to make sure I'm giving you the whole picture, so let me start at the beginning. One of the big tech businesses in Seattle employs me as a senior software architect. My dad always had this kind of job in mind for me. Technology is the future, he would exclaim proudly after I was accepted to UW's computer science program. He had a profitable construction business and wasn't a techie, but he had a remarkable knack for predicting trends. Beginning with the recession of the late 1980s, Dad started his construction business from the ground up throughout some of the most difficult periods in the industry. He took on projects that other contractors wouldn't take on, using only a pickup truck and his tools. Back then, Mom told me, they lived in a small apartment and were frugal, but Dad had this unwavering faith in his vision. He would frequently remark, "The key is to build relationships, not just buildings." That way of thinking got him through his difficult early years. Dad's business was unique because of the way he treated both customers and staff. Even if it meant losing some bids to rivals who made exaggerated deadline promises, he was a firm believer in open pricing and truthful schedules. First, establish trust, he would advise. He was correct when he said, the profits will follow. His business, which was renowned for taking on intricate restoration projects requiring both technical expertise and historical sensitivity, rose to prominence in the Seattle area by the mid-1990s. Because of the devotion he had developed with his clients and staff, Dad's business survived the 2008 financial crisis, when many construction companies were failing. He didn't fire a single employee during that period. Rather, he reduced his personal income to zero and took out a second mortgage on his cherished Mustang. I learned more about leadership from watching him handle that issue than I could have from any management course. Your employees are your extended family, he told me. You take care of them, they'll take care of your business. I didn't realize at the time how much his managerial approach affected my own career. Many of his ideas were put to use when I was promoted to team lead at my software business. I established thorough documentation procedures for our code, much as he had kept thorough project logs for every building site. I was able to lead my development team through challenging project deadlines thanks to his attention on fostering good relationships. I met Emily, 34F, at a hackathon in my junior year. She assisted in planning the event while pursuing her studies in business administration. Despite my lack of sleep, energy drink addiction, and likely messy appearance, she somehow found my love of code charming. From the first time he laid eyes on her, Dad fell in love. He told me, she grounds you. Following their first meal together. Don't let this one get away. After college, Dad even assisted Emily in launching her own marketing firm. He introduced her to his network of local company owners, showed her how he drafted his contracts, and shared his business objectives with her. He would tell us, success isn't just about what you know. It's about helping others succeed too. Dad was always imparting his expertise and educating. Those formative years were unique. Emily and I would always make the drive to my parents' house on Sundays to have dinner. We would all sit on the back deck that Dad had constructed and chat about everything and nothing while he lit the grill. Even though he couldn't understand the majority of the technical details of my most recent work, he would still ask in-depth inquiries. Mom used to say, "There they go again with the computer talk," with a loving eye roll. Dad's pride and joy was the house itself. He purchased it with the proceeds from his first significant construction job in the 1990s, which was a historic restoration project that made his business famous. In one of Seattle's older neighborhoods, this lovely craftsman-style home features a wraparound porch and a garage that he transformed into the most well-organized workshop you've ever seen. Labeled and placed with almost fanatical precision, each tool has its place. Dad handled the house as though it were a living example of his skill. Every renovation was meticulously organized and recorded. Every repair, improvement and paint job was documented in a thorough spreadsheet that he maintained. A house is like a living thing, he would say as he demonstrated for me how to clean the gutters or inspect the foundation. He maintained a maintenance regimen that included everything from checking the roof after winter storms to changing air filters. Neglect the little things, and they become big problems. In addition to being his haven, the workshop served as a classroom where he taught me about subjects other than tools. In addition to adding unique storage options and a workbench he made especially for teaching me woodworking, he had completely renovated the garage himself. He would say, every piece of wood has its own story. As we were working, the pegboard wall with delineated shapes for each tool wasn't just about organization. It was his method of teaching me that everything has a place and a purpose. Our job is to help tell that story. Our family held weekends in high regard. In that garage, Dad and I would work on his 1967 Mustang for hours on end. When I was 12, Dad had purchased it for restoration, claiming it would be a project that would strengthen our bond as father and son. That vehicle turned into a life lessons classroom. His advice, which I still abide by now, was straightforward. Always use the right tool for the job. Or shortcuts look tempting, but they'll cost you in the long run. Although Dad might have completed the Mustang project in 1 year if he had so desired, it took 3 years. However, he was more interested in the process than the final destination. I learned everything from project management to fundamental mechanics from him. We took pictures of every component we changed, recorded each step and maintained thorough logs of our development. This isn't just about fixing a car, he would affirm. It's about learning how to break down big problems into manageable pieces. I found that lesson to be really helpful in my profession as a software developer. Emily and I purchased a small home around 20 minutes from my parents' house after we were married. Although Dad insisted that we take out the mortgage in our names, Dad assisted us with the down payment. You need to build your own credit history, he clarified. It's about standing on your own feet. He taught me how to install ceiling fans and fix drywall as he worked on our renovations on the weekends. He was preparing me for the responsibilities of home ownership even back then. At this time, my career was really taking off. I'd just received a promotion to team lead, overseeing a team that was creating cloud infrastructure solutions. I enjoyed every second of it, even if the hours were long and the strain was great. During my lunch breaks, Dad would frequently call to check in, without discussing anything specific. He was aware of the demands of managing a group and overseeing the work of others. Remember to delegate, he would say. You can't do everything yourself, just like I can't build a house alone. When Dad initially stated feeling exhausted all the time, we were discussing the possibility of starting a family. He continued to put off seeing a doctor, despite Mom's insistence. Just working too hard, he would dismiss our worries. He was working on his largest project to date, a multi-million-dollar development deal that would have established his business for the ensuing 10 years. In retrospect, I regret not pressing harder and insisting on those examinations sooner. Perhaps things might have turned out differently. At the time, the business was expanding quickly. Dad was discussing growing into historical restoration projects in the Pacific Northwest and had recently launched a second office in Portland. He has established a reputation for updating the infrastructure of historic structures without sacrificing their character. He would tell his clients, it's about embracing the future while respecting the past. Everything he accomplished, including his personal and professional life, was impacted by his love of preservation. The Mustang was the subject of our last meaningful discussion. He was discussing taking it to car shows now that we had completed the restoration. When he remarked, we should sign up for the Pacific Northwest Classic, his eyes glowed like a child's. He continued to plan for the future until the very end, saying, show these youngsters what a real muscle car looks like. It began like any other morning until everything changed. When Mom called, my phone buzzed while I was in an early meeting. We were in the midst of an important project conversation, so I nearly didn't respond. But I had to go out and take it for some reason. Mom was crying so hard she was having trouble speaking. Dad had passed out on a construction site. He had left by the time I arrived at the hospital. According to the physicians, it was a sudden and severe heart attack. He was only 58. The weeks following Dad's passing were a haze of mourning and bureaucracy. The funeral was crowded. Dad's business and community involvement had impacted countless people. Suppliers, contractors, and even rival businesses came to show their support. Everybody shared a story about how Dad had supported them, given them advice, or simply been there for them when they needed someone to confide in. One old craftsman told me how, despite being unable to work during a protracted illness, Dad had managed to keep him on the payroll. Your father understood that business was about people first, he stated. The workers of the company were heartbroken. Many of them had known Dad for decades, and they told me things I had never heard before, like how he had paid for the college textbooks of one foreman's daughter, assisted another through a divorce, or remained late to teach apprentices the nuances of historical restoration. With pictures and handwritten remarks from both clients and employees, the workplace conference room was transformed into an unofficial monument. We were all surprised by how well Dad had prepared for everything. His attorney, Mr. Anderson, summoned us in for a meeting a week following the funeral. He took out this enormous accordion file that read Family Security Protocol and was neatly handwritten by Dad. Dozens of carefully arranged papers with comprehensive instructions for various areas of his land were found within. I was given a 3-day tour of Dad's estate paperwork by Mr. Anderson. Each color-coded container had personal notes outlining his decisions in addition to legal paperwork. "I've never seen an estate plan this thoroughly in my 35 years of practice," Mr. Anderson remarked. Dad had even included a 5-year business transition plan with backup plans for various circumstances. After that, Mom began going to her church's bereavement support group. She first met Steve, 58M, there. Initially, she only mentioned him in passing. Steve suggested this great book about healing. Or, Steve said it's normal to feel this way. He was one of the group facilitators and had lost his wife to cancer 2 years earlier. Even if it seemed a little early, I was happy that she was receiving support. I was reminded by Emily that everyone experiences grief in a unique way. Every Tuesday night, the church grief support group met. Before long, Mom was attending church functions with Steve more often. After services, coffee gatherings became lunch meetings, which in turn became dinner dates. Our family friends began to worry about how quickly their friendship was developing. At a family get-together, my Aunt Jane pulled me aside because she was concerned that Mom was hurrying into things to make up for Dad's absence. Mom's changes became more apparent. Her haircut changed, she started dressing differently, and she even threw out the garden that Dad had helped her create. Every time I questioned these changes, she would respond, "It's time for a fresh start." Dad was hardly ever mentioned by the woman who used to spend hours narrating her life with him. It went more quickly than any of us had anticipated. Mom announced that Steve was moving in 6 months after Dad's death. James, 30M, and Lisa, 32F, his own grown children, felt it would be beneficial to bring life back into the house. I made an effort to be sympathetic, but it seemed like she was in a rush to replace everything Dad had constructed. "I'm at a crossroads right now. How can I preserve Dad's legacy without jeopardizing Mom's chances for happiness? Emily advises me to strike a balance, but I can't help but think of Dad's letter. Son, preserve those memories. First update. I apologize for the wait for the update and appreciate all of the advice you gave on my previous article. 3 months have passed since my last post, and things have become much worse. Steve's domineering demeanor used to bother me, but now he acts as though he owns the house my dad left me. Steve made the decision to begin a significant restoration project last month without even asking my permission. The built-in bookshelves my dad had made for the living room were being torn up by contractors when I visited one weekend. As if he owned the building, Steve was watching over them and directing them to just throw all this old wood in the dumpster. These were the final project Dad and I worked on together before he became ill, so they were more than just shelves. He responded angrily when I approached him. He said, "Look, son," with a condescending emphasis on the pronoun. "This house needs to be brought into the 21st century. Your father's taste was, well, dated. We're doing you a favor by increasing the property value." I reminded him that any modifications required my consent legally. Mom obviously agreed with him, but he simply chuckled and added, "Your mother and I live here. We don't need permission to improve our home." "Steve knows about these things," she acknowledged. "He's just trying to help." The woman who formerly loved those bookshelves and used to place her collection of antique teacups on them for Christmas now acts as though they were just taking up room. I showed her Dad's thorough house maintenance plans, but she disregarded them as dwelling in the past. Additionally, the relationship with Steve's children has deteriorated. James has taken over Dad's workshop and transformed it into a CrossFit facility. While I was on a business trip, he held a garage sale and sold the majority of Dad's tools. By repainting rooms and installing modern vinyl planks in place of Dad's meticulously refinished hardwood floors, Lisa is treating the space as though it were her own personal design project. One evening after dinner, Steve grabbed me aside and said, "Since we're paying to live here, we should have our names on the deed. It's only fair." I had to explain him that they don't pay a mortgage because Dad's planning has paid for the house in full. They don't even cover their rent. All maintenance expenses, insurance, and property taxes are paid for by me. Emily recommended that we stop making weekly visits. Now that Emma is here, she is correct. No one benefits from the stress in that household. However, taking a back seat has only made Steve more confident. He began sending me bills for improvements that I never approved, and he began making them more regularly. I should be more sympathetic of Mom's new life, according to Mom's sister, who called me recently. I attempted to explain Dad's intentions and my legal obligations, but she simply accused me of being trapped in the past. "Steve makes her happy. Why can't you just let them make the house their own?" she asked. I found out this week that the growth markers that recorded my height from the ages of 3 to 18 had been removed from the kitchen door frame. Every birthday, Dad would measure me and write the date next to each mark. "It's just an old door frame. We can't keep every piece of wood just because your father touched it," Mom remarked when I confronted her about it. I now spend more time sitting in Dad's old chair, the only piece of furniture I was able to keep, in my own garage. Mr. Anderson advises me to begin considering long-term fixes. Legally, the house belongs to me, but I will eventually have to make some difficult choices regarding its destiny. When does being the bad guy become more important than preserving your father's legacy? And when your whole family opposes you, how do you defend the moral high ground? Update 2. I appreciate all of your advice regarding my previous post. The situation has reached a breaking point and I've finally made a choice that will most likely alter everything. I spoke with my financial advisor about the house situation last week. We may make a sizable rental income, enough to cover Emma's future college fund, because nearby property values have risen by 40% in the last 3 years. I discovered at the discussion that I had been so preoccupied with the sentimental elements that I had failed to take into account the financial ramifications of allowing Mom and Steve to live rent-free. Everything went haywire when I brought this up to Mom in our weekly conversation. She yelled into the phone, "You can't do this to us. This is where we call home. Steve has worked really hard on it." She refused to listen when I tried to explain that I was only considering my choices. She continued to talk about all the enhancements they had made, utterly disregarding the fact that I had never given my approval for these changes. An hour later, Steve called. He was upset, and his tone was different from his usual arrogant demeanor. "Listen here," he announced. "In this house, we have established a life. Because you're missing your father, you can't just walk in and ruin everything." He interrupted me when I attempted to explain the financial issues, stating that they now had sweat equity in the property. I reminded him that the house belonged to me legally. "There's a reason why Dad left it to me." "Your father isn't here anymore," he replied. "You must consider the living." I talked to Emily about it and talked to Mr. Anderson about it before deciding on it the following day. When I arrived at the house, Mom and Steve were working on yet another remodeling job. In the dining room, they had begun ripping out the original crown molding, which Dad had specifically milled to blend in with the house's antique style. That image made me more determined. "They have 2 weeks to find another place to live," I told them. Mom burst into tears at once, accusing me of being callous and harsh. Steve tried to scare me by arguing with me about my inability to throw them out on the street. He began enumerating all of their local ties, including his place of employment, their church, and their neighborhood pals. When faced with challenging circumstances, I maintained my composure and firmness, as my father had taught me. I declared, "This is my property. Dad left it to me for a reason, and I'm exercising my legal right as the owner." Steve's cheeks flushed, and he began to enumerate all the money they had spent on upgrades. I informed him that the historical value of the property had actually been diminished by these unapproved alterations. When Lisa returned home and joined the debate, things became worse. Mom utilized her pregnancy as emotional leverage right away. "How are you able to treat your stepsister in this way? She will give birth to a child." Although Lisa's pregnancy is significant to them, I had to tell them that it does not affect my property rights and that she is not my stepsister. There has been an ongoing assault of emotional manipulation ever since. Mom's whole family has banded together to oppose me. Her sister called, sobbing, and said their parents wanted to make sure Mom was safe. Messages regarding the challenging rental market were left by Steve's brother, a local real estate agent. Long messages on Christian ideals and family loyalty are even coming from distant cousins who I hardly know. Dealing with family friends who have known me since my early years is the most difficult. People who grew up with me now tell me how unhappy they are with my decisions, and every call seems like another tiny betrayal. Some even claim that I'm damaging Dad's standing in the neighborhood. The problem is that this has nothing to do with cruelty or profit. This is about honoring Dad's desires and preserving the things he created. It has been agonizing enough to see them methodically destroy all traces of him. The house was his legacy. I've paid for all of their expenses, allowed them to live rent-free for years, and put up with their unapproved changes. Eventually, enough is enough. They have 2 weeks to come up with new plans. I'm refusing to give in to Mom's constant demands for more time. Mr. Anderson claims that the law is entirely on my side and that I have been more than giving. He is assisting me with creating official paperwork for the notice to vacate, ensuring that everything is accurately documented. I realize that this makes me appear to be the villain in everyone else's tale, but sometimes standing up for what's right requires making difficult choices, even when others disagree. I learned that from my dad. Third update. We appreciate everyone's help at this trying time. Things have come to an unavoidable end, therefore this will likely be my last update. I assigned Mom and Steve a 2-week deadline, but it's already passed. The past 2 weeks have been the longest of my life. They have been filled with guilt-tripping, continual emotional manipulation, and progressively frantic attempts to get me to change my mind. Mom did everything she could. Every day she called, oscillating between fury and tears. She would say, "I changed your diapers," one day. "I gave up everything for you," she would yell the next day. Steve also changed strategies, trying to negotiate instead of using intimidation. He recommended establishing a formal lease and offered to begin paying rent. I couldn't rely on them to uphold whatever agreements we made though, given what they had done to Dad's house. When I got to the house, there were people gathering on the front lawn 3 days prior to the deadline. Mom had enlisted the help of friends from church, family, and even some of Dad's former business partners. They had prepared statements about moral commitments and family responsibilities as part of what amounted to an intervention. I listened to people criticize me for being a bad son for 2 hours. The topic of honoring your parents was discussed by Mom's pastor. Dad's old secretary remembered his generosity with tears in her eyes. My elementary school teacher even came to remind me of the morals my father had attempted to teach me. The hardest part was when Lisa got up and talked about how stress could hurt her unborn child while covering her pregnant abdomen with her hands. While Mom was crying next to her, a few of the church women were glaring at me. It was an expert lesson in manipulating emotions. But during this ambush, an unexpected event occurred. I had a strange sense of serenity as I sat there listening to everyone talk about Dad. People who hadn't even been to his funeral suddenly professing to know what he would have wanted. Dad used to say, "Stand your ground when you know you're right." And I could almost hear his voice in my thoughts. I got to my feet and spoke to the group. I described how Dad planned everything carefully to ensure his family's future and how he had constructed this house by hand. I showed them pictures of Steve's unapproved modifications, including the historical elements he ruined and the fine craftsmanship he removed and replaced with flimsy modern fixtures. After that, I presented them with a letter from Dad outlining his reasons for leaving everything to me. Some of the elder business associates nodded as I read his remarks about trust, accountability, and preserving his legacy. They understood because they'd known Dad, really knew him. Shortly thereafter, the group scattered. While some looked disapproving, the righteous wrath had subsided, and others gently apologized as they walked away. Without saying another word, Mom and Steve returned inside. I showed there with Mr. Anderson and a locksmith on the morning of the deadline. Although they weren't required, I had hired a security company to be on hand just in case. The house was deserted. The remainder of their possessions were packed into Steve's truck. Steve couldn't help but give me a last poke, but Mom refused to look at me. As he assisted Lisa into his pickup, he asked, "You're happy with yourself? Your father would be so proud of how you've treated your mother." I didn't answer. Dad would have known. I know he had prepared for this possibility. What other reason might he have had for being so explicit in his will? I strolled about the home after they had left. I had underestimated the extent of the harm. Builder-grade materials had been used to replace the original fittings. Dad had painted over or taken out his handcrafted woodwork. We had spent so many weekends at the workshop, and it had changed completely. I have no intention of pursuing damages, but Mr. Anderson documented everything for any legal considerations. I simply want to put this chapter behind me and concentrate on fixing what can be fixed. Some of Dad's old craftsman friends have already been contacted, and they are eager to assist in rebuilding the features that were taken out. For now, Mom is staying with her sister. The majority of my relatives have stopped talking to me altogether, however some sometimes call to chastise me. On social media, Steve's children continue to share heartbreaking updates about their poor mother being thrown out of her home, but fewer people are responding to each post. Through it all, Emily has been my pillar of support. She reminds me of Dad's letter whenever I begin to doubt myself, expressing his faith in my ability to make the right choices. I will eventually tell Emma about her grandfather and the heritage he attempted to preserve, but she is too little to comprehend what is occurring right now. To restore the house to its original state, I'm collaborating with a restoration professional. We can preserve the spirit of what Dad made, but it won't be perfect. Some things can't be reversed. First, the workshop will be restored. The same place where I learned from my father is where I want my daughter to study. Being the villain in someone else's tale is sometimes the price of doing the right thing. I may never be able to rebuild the relationships I lost, but I can live with the fact that I preserved what my father trusted me with. As Dad used to say, integrity is about doing the right thing, even when it hurts, and not about taking the easy route. I believe he would comprehend. My last update will be this one. I appreciate everyone's support along this journey. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.